Welcome to the Evidential Faith Podcast, where a father-son duo explore the scientific, historical, and philosophical evidence for the God of the Bible. The goal of this podcast is to encourage believers and challenge skeptics to consider the reliability of Jesus in the Bible. All right, welcome back, podcast world, to the Evidential Faith Podcast. My name is Jake Nash, and with me, as always, is my co-host and my father, Troy Nash. Today, I am super excited about this episode for two reasons. The first is that the topic we're discussing is really interesting, and I think that the evidence that we're going to present for a creator, for God, is very compelling, and I hope that it can convince some people. The second reason is I have an interesting statistic to share with you. And Dad, I haven't even told you this yet. So you ready to hear my interesting statistic? All right. So 90% of all podcasts that are started don't make it past the third episode. So you and I and the Evidential Faith Podcast are in an elite group of podcasts where we can say we have 4 episodes as of today.
Sweet.
99% do not make it past 20 episodes. So at our 21st episode, we'll bake a cake or something. So that's my fun little podcast statistic there for you. But without further ado, let's just go ahead and jump into today's episode and what we're going to be talking about. So if you remember last episode, we discussed the precision and the fine tuning that exists in our universe to allow for life to exist on Earth, and how that precision points to intelligent designer. So if you haven't seen the last episode, I encourage you to go watch it. We talk about how finely tuned everything in the universe is to specifically support life on Earth. In this episode, we're going to discuss that life on Earth and talk about how we got here. Is life on Earth and humans and all the animals that we see, is this a result of unguided evolutionary process, or is it designed? So we're gonna discuss that and talk about the different options and different hypotheses as to where life came from. So, Dad, why don't you take it away and we'll get going.
Okay. All right. So we're going to take a look, first of all, at history, kind of the science of the origin of life. So early scientists, those before Charles Darwin, they accepted the biblical account of creation, namely that God created life just from their observations. You know, they could see that life was extremely complex. There was a huge biodiversity out there, and they accepted the biblical account of the creation of life. And then in the mid-1800s, along comes Charles Darwin. Darwin was not a trained scientist, but what he was good at was observing nature. He spent years observing animals, taking copious notes. He spent a good deal of time in the Galapagos Islands, where he famously observed the changes occurring in the size and shape of beaks of finches, the birds that lived on the island. Mm-hmm. He observed that these changes were caused by environmental changes that affected the food supply for the finches. He observed that the size and the shape of the beaks changed depending upon the nature of the food source that was available. The finches with the beaks that best suited the current food supply would thrive, while the other finches not suited for that type of food would die off. Mm-hmm. Essentially, survival of the fittest. And he coined this natural selection.
Right.
And Darwin hypothesized that this natural selection over long periods of time was responsible for the changes in plants and animals, and thus the diversity of life that everyone observed. It wasn't God, it was nature. Darwin was an atheist, and he did not believe in God. Mm-hmm. Darwin's tree of life, illustrating that life began with simple organisms, and through natural selection, they became more and more complex over time as needed to survive. As scientists realized that there were some limitations to what natural selection could do, they added random mutations to Darwin's hypothesis.
Mm-hmm. To try to explain the differences in creatures and in animals.
So they realized that there were some limitations to what natural selection could explain as far as the diversity of life.
Right.
So they also realized and observed that mutations were a real thing, and so they hypothesized that if you included random mutations in those results, that it could explain pretty much all of what we see in life and
Yep.
the complexity of life.
Yep. Yeah, I remember learning about Darwin and his finches in middle school science class, and that
Yeah.
was the origin of life that I learned about when I was in public school. So, yeah.
Yeah. So Darwin's hypothesis really didn't gain much traction until the mid 1950s, when James Watson and Francis Crick discovered the helical structure of the DNA molecule.
Hmm.
And Watson and Crick were very outspoken atheists. They were strong, had a strong distaste for religion. And with their discovery of the DNA structure, they announced that they had found the quote molecule of life, suggesting that life was based on chemistry, thus discrediting the God hypothesis for creation of life. And in 1958, Francis Crick proposed the sequence hypothesis, which simply stated that along the spine of the DNA molecule, amino acids are arranged in very specific sequences to form protein folds.
Okay.
The specific sequence determines the type of protein fold and its function. All right, so these protein folds are critical for forming all types of things in the cells. The cell types, for example, heart cells or lung cells or brain cells, right?
Hmm.
They're responsible for enzymes and the creation of organs in your body, etc. So
And
these
there's
are highly complex,
yeah.
highly organized sequences of amino acids, and each amino acid has a specific sequence.
Hmm.
So with this discovery, it became clear that DNA is really a digital code that carries genetic instructions for all living organisms. And this digital code is very similar to computer software code. And Bill Gates is quoted as saying that DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created.
Hmm.
This quote emphasizes the complexity and sophistication of DNA compared to even the most advanced human made software. So, DNA even has built in mechanisms for repairing the code.
Hmm.
So, imagine writing a software program that repaired itself. I mean,
Yeah.
DNA is extremely advanced. So, by 1968, evolution was the theory, and it was what was being taught in most schools.
Hmm.
It was in fact, creationism in 1968. There was a court case that ruled that schools had to teach evolution as a
Huh.
theory of life. Um, so the theory basically states that random mutations and natural selection acting on the DNA code was thought to be the mechanism that explained all the diversity of life that we see.
Hmm.
So God was out and evolution was in. So
Yeah.
that's a short, brief history of kind of how evolution became a theory and how it was taught in schools. So we're going to take a look now at some challenges to this theory of evolution.
Hmm.
And so the first one that we'll take a look at is called irreducible complexity. And this was proposed in 1996 by Michael Behe. He's a professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University. And he wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box, where he introduces a challenge to evolution in a concept called irreducible complexity. And Dr. Behe believes that complex systems within living organisms cannot have evolved piece by piece over millions of years.
Right.
That all the parts of a system have to come together at the same time in order for the system to function. I mean, it makes perfect sense. So Behe highlights a nanomachine inside of some bacteria called a flagellum. And he chose bacteria because it's the simplest form of life, but he wanted
Yeah.
to show, even in a bacteria, just how complex some of these systems can be. So this flagellum provides locomotion for the cell. And this little machine has a rotor, has a stator, a drive shaft, a U-joint, bushings, bearings, and a whip-like tail that functions like a propeller. This amazing little motor can turn at 100,000 RPMs, 100,000 revolutions per minute. And
Hmm.
in some bacteria, it can even stop and reverse directions.
And that's what like allows bacteria to move? Is that what
Yeah,
this is?
so
Okay.
that allows it. It acts like a little propeller, and it
Wow.
allows motion in a fluid
Wow.
environment. And this little system has a signal transduction element that helps the bacteria follow a food source. When it senses a food source, it can track that food source. And
Mm-hmm.
likewise, when it senses a threat, it will reverse course and reverse direction.
Hmm.
So Behe proposed that each part of this motor, each of these little elements, is critical to the function of it. And
Yeah.
it can't function by missing some of these pieces. So all of these pieces would have had to have evolved together at the same time. And that's not how evolution works. Evolution works piece by piece
Over
over
billions
millions
of
of years,
years.
small
Yeah.
micro little changes,
Yep.
right? To
Yep.
the DNA code over time, over long periods of time.
Yep.
And so Behe was proposing that this didn't make sense, that what he was seeing in these complex systems doesn't fit with the evolutionary model. And we can look at complex systems within our own body. We have some
Mm-hmm.
very, very complex systems. Our vision is incredibly complex. I mean, if you think about our eyes and all the parts of our eyes that have to function all together to make vision happen.
Right. Our lenses and our corneas and the cones in our eyes and everything that
Yeah.
if one of them's wrong, then you can't see.
The optic nerve, which has to
Yeah.
communicate to all the brain cells
Yep.
to communicate that vision. And it can't, without those, if your optic nerve is missing, you have no sight.
Yep.
All of that has to come together at the same time and
Right.
together and work in cohesive fashion. So from an evolutionary standpoint, it doesn't make a lot of sense that these things can happen piece by piece over millions of years and then somehow come together, and it just doesn't make sense from that standpoint. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
so
I
that's
I just
go ahead.
remember, sorry, I just remember looking, in my textbooks as a kid, pictures of like this anamorphic type timeline of a fish, and then halfway through is like this fish with kind of legs and he's trying to crawl out, and then all of a sudden it's a frog. And it's like you can't just get from one to the other and have this kind of mutant in the middle that isn't quite a fish and it isn't quite a frog and it doesn't quite have eyes and it can't quite breathe air. That doesn't make sense. It can only be one or the other. I also think of like working on cars. If you've ever worked on a car, everything has to work together. A 4-stroke engine works on bang bang squeeze, or suck squeeze bang blow. You suck in air, you squeeze it, you compress it, you ignite the fuel, and you blow it out. And everything has to be in the right timing, and the pistons have to work together in the timing belt with all the oil and with the coolant. And if there's anything wrong in that huge system, everything falls apart. And so you can't build a engine piece by piece and have it work in this mid stage. It doesn't work until everything is together. And if everything is together and one thing is wrong, like one bolt is loose because you don't have the right tool, like we did when we tried to fix my Mini Cooper, you start it up and it doesn't work.
System failure. Yeah.
Yeah, and you have to start over. So you can't have a half built engine or a half built mammal that comes from bacteria and it work. It does it. We see that all the time in everything. And so
Yeah.
it doesn't. Irreducible complexity shows that you can't have these in between mutants and have them survive, really. So
Right.
yeah, that's the first one, and that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. All right. So the next objection to the theory of evolution is the fossil record itself.
Hmm.
So the fossil record does not show a linear progression from simple organisms to complex organisms.
Yeah.
What we see are explosions of complex life that suddenly appear in the fossil record. The most well known of these is called the Cambrian explosion. And in the Cambrian rock layers, so the Cambrian period is a layer of rock formations that represent a time through in history, right? And
Okay.
so in this Cambrian rock layer, there's a sudden explosion of complex life forms with no trace of transitional fossils in the lower Precambrian rocks.
Hmm.
So this presents a challenge to the slow, gradual, continuous process of evolution. Right? And
Hmm.
some of these life forms that they see in the Cambrian layers are extremely complex. Some of them have compound eyes like modern insects have,
Hmm.
where there are some of them that have up to 3,000 lenses on their eyes. And so again, this would go back to this irreducible complexity argument too, that we just don't see in the fossil record how you would see like these transitional tiny little changes that eventually make up, you know, what we would know as that particular organism
Right.
in its complete and functional state. So the fossil record really does not support evolution. Um,
Yeah, that's
so I would
shocking.
encourage people. What's that?
That's shocking. I just always
Yeah,
assumed that it was that yeah, there was these intermediate steps, these intermediate creatures, and it's not the case. They just, like the Cambrian explosion, these fossils just explode out of nothing, and all of a sudden, layers of rock. There's nothing, 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 and in the next layer, there's all these complex organisms that weren't there the previous time. So
right.
how do you explain the sudden spike in complex organisms through evolution? I don't think you can.
Yeah. So yeah, given the time length of what that layer represents, there's just not
Right.
enough time
Yeah.
in the evolutionary process to produce all these complex animals in that Cambrian rock layer.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's another challenge to the theory of evolution. The the next challenge comes from the world of intelligent design, and it asks the question, where does the information come from to produce the complex DNA code?
Hmm.
So Dr. Stephen Meyer is a kind of a pioneer in this endeavor, and he has written a book called Signature in the Cell. And he presents a compelling challenge to evolution by asking the question, where does the information come from to produce the complex digital code of DNA?
Hmm.
So the DNA of even the simplest living organisms contains a tremendous amount of information. So for example, a bacteria, depending upon the species, will contain between 580,000 and 13 million base pairs of amino acids.
In a specific order, right? Not
Right.
just
And these
random.
base pairs, yeah, they're arranged in precise sequences, much like a digital code, much
Yeah.
like a software code, just like as Bill Gates said that it's like a software code. And that code provides instructions for the developments of proteins, lipids, carbohydrates needed for the production of cells. So think about a base pair, an amino acid base pair, as a word.
Hmm.
Okay, and the protein folds that they form, the specific sequences of these amino acids form folds.
Okay.
And if you think about those as a complex sentence, okay, and for comparison, the King James Bible contains approximately 780,000 words, okay? So the DNA of some bacteria contains more than 16 times as much information as the King James Bible.
Wow.
And what about human DNA? So human DNA contains about 3 billion base pairs, billion with a B,
Mm.
or 3,846 times as much information as the King James Bible. And all of this information is amazingly stored in a very small space about the size of the head of a pin.
That is crazy.
And I mean, computer scientists would they're just mind boggled at how much information storage capacity there is in the DNA molecule.
Yeah, that's insane.
I mean, to be able to store that much information in such a tiny space and have it be such precise um, information is just it's incredible.
Yeah.
So where does this information come from? So you want to take this part here and then are there any unguided processes that we know of?
Yeah, yeah. Where does this come from? It's not a like we said, it's not random. It's not that there is billions of base pairs that you just roll a dice and whatever letters it comes out to in the alphabet of amino acids, it makes it work. No, it has to be in a specific order. And as far as we know, there are no known unguided material processes that can produce functional information. In other words, meaning the information that provides instructions or conveys a message or shows a complex pattern. And Dr. Meyer in his book points out that we know from our repeated experience that this type of information only comes from an intelligent mind. And we can see this immediately, right? For example, if you take alphabet cereal and you dump it out on the table, you might be able to make a few words out of it without moving any of the pieces of cereal. You might be able to make the word at or I'm, but if you dumped it out and then walked away and came back and you saw take out the garbage, love mom, and you look over and see the windows open, you wouldn't automatically assume, oh, the window's open, so the wind must have blown that around and created this sentence. No, you would assume that somebody, an intelligent being, namely named Mom, came and arranged those in a way to be kind of a petty way to tell you how to take out of the trash, right? So we see this in our lives. We don't see order coming from disorder. We always see order coming from order. And so like the cereal, DNA has a very specific set of code to allow for life to occur. And when presented with this argument, Darwinists might say, okay, well, given enough time, the amino acids in the DNA molecule could arrange themselves in the correct order by chance. And therefore, we don't need a designer to drive them out. If you give it enough time, those pieces of cereal may arrange themselves over billions and billions of years to create complex sentences. And so we don't need the model of a god or an intelligent being to create those complex structures, because over time it'll do it itself. Well, we know from our second episode that the second law of thermodynamics says that as time goes on, things become more and more random, not ordered. So the more time you have in a system, it doesn't allow for more order, more disorder comes from that. And I think of it like this, like if I had a deck of cards and I shuffled it and I wanted to allow chance to reorder those cards in ascending order, I might like drop it from waist height and the cards would fall and maybe I would see, okay, let's see if they land in a specific order. Well, obviously they're not going to. So what if we took that same deck, shuffled it, and went up to 30,000 feet in an airplane and dropped it there? That would give it more time to reorder, right? Chance would have more time. But we know that the cards would not move themselves in a more ordered way. It would become disordered. The cards would go further away from themselves and become more random. So unfortunately, given more time, those cards will fly further away from each other and have a less chance to reorder themselves properly. And as time goes on, things always become more disorderly. Time always breaks things up. It breaks things down. It doesn't build them up, just like our bodies or our cars or anything that we see. Time always breaks things down and creates disorder or entropy. So
But without this long periods of time, evolution falls apart.
right.
And you can't have evolution in short, at least macro evolution we're talking about in short periods of time. It doesn't happen like that. So what are some other things that maybe could explain the information? How about natural selection? Could natural selection produce the needed information to explain these complex life forms? And the short answer to that is no. Natural selection only selects for traits that already are present in the genetic code of that organism.
Yeah.
It does a good job of explaining minor changes that occur, right? Like changes that allow for adaptation, just like the beaks, the finches, their beaks. It does a good job of explaining those minor little variations within a species, but it does not produce new information needed to build new body plans or new life forms.
Right. We always see different kinds of mutations or things that in their genetics that change, like the clownfish example, that the clownfish that more closely resemble the coral in their natural environment tend to survive better, and over time the more those survive more, and then they breed, and so all the clownfish look the same or have a better chance. That's the same thing, chance of survival. That's the same type of logic as the beaks of the finches, but at the end of the day, they're still clownfish, or they're still finches, or we have all these different kinds of dogs and we can interbreed them and create all these different dogs, but they're still dogs. They don't ever become something other than a dog. So natural selection in itself can't produce the information needed to change complex life forms.
Right. And so what about mutations? So all known mutations actually result in a loss of information, not a gain of new information. So this loss of information can be beneficial. There are beneficial mutations, and an example of this would be sickle cell anemia. So the people that have sickle cell anemia, they have a specific mutation that is actually beneficial to them if they live in an environment where malaria is common, like in Africa, because they are not susceptible to malaria. They're
Huh.
not they don't aren't killed by malaria. But sickle cell anemia has other problems. It's a disease and it causes other issues. So just because it has a beneficial effect, it doesn't mean that it's producing some new information that's going to arrive at a new life form. It's actually a loss of information that results in that mutation. And in all known cases, mutations result in a loss of information, not a gain of new information. So
Huh.
mutations can't explain this, explosion of information that would be needed to go from a bacteria to a human. I mean, you would need an explosion of new information,
Yeah.
new body parts. So it can't explain that type of information.
Yeah.
So, but what about, so Jake, let's look at the fact that our DNA is very similar to other animals. And
Yeah.
isn't that proof that evolution is true?
No, no, I don't think so at all. I always heard that where whatever the number is, 90% the same DNA information as a chimp, or there's 50% towards a banana. And I've always heard that argument, but as an engineer and as somebody who writes a lot of software, I think that that is a better proof, not for a common ancestor, but a common designer. When I'm writing code, I like to pull from things that I know work. And so when I'm writing code, I take an outline that I've already used and adjust it to do something very similar. And that makes a lot of sense in the fact that we live in this Goldilocks zone of Earth and the universe that allows life. And so it makes a lot of sense that life itself has to be very similar to be able to survive in the Goldilocks zone that we live in. And so if one thing works, then okay, I want to take that piece of code and change it a little bit to make something new. And that's proof of a designer. That's not proof of a similar ancestor. I don't think that that's a very good argument at all. Like we have to live in this very slim chance of survival that is our tiny little planet. And so the type of life that exists here and can only exist is very slim. This carbon type life that breathes air or CO2 as in plants, or we have to be similar or else we wouldn't survive. And so I think that shows the creativity and the intelligence of God, and not the fact that we come from the same single-celled organism in this primordial ooze that Darwinists explain away the origins of life from.
Yeah. So you mentioned that the similarities between chimp and human DNA, right?
Yeah.
So actually, the number that was thrown around was 99%. That humans and chimpanzees shared 99% similar DNA, right? And they were touting this as proof of evolution, that we evolved, that we chimpanzees and humans evolved from a common ancestor.
Yeah.
They weren't necessarily saying that we evolved from chimpanzees or the chimpanzees evolved from us, but that we evolved from a common ancestor,
Right.
right? Well, there's some real problems with this. First of all, I won't get into the design of the study because it'll take too much time. But let's just point out that there's a brand new study that just came out within the last few months. It was published in the journal Nature, and it was they went back and they looked at the DNA sequences of both humans and chimpanzees in a much more extensive manner. So the first time they compared them and they came up with this 99% figure, they left out large portions of our DNA code because they didn't know what these specific items or specific sections of the DNA code did. They
Yeah.
weren't coding for proteins, so they thought, okay, well, this is just junk DNA, they called it. And they thought it was left over from our evolutionary process, that we didn't need any of this stuff anymore. So when they compared the narrow scope of the DNA between humans and chimpanzees, sure enough, there was like a 99% correlation. The problem was that they left out huge parts of the DNA molecule. And as they learned more and more about the DNA, they realized, oh, this isn't junk. It actually does have functions
Yeah.
for things other than coding for proteins.
Yeah.
So they went back and they did this whole comprehensive study, and they were, this information is published in the journal Nature, and what they have found is that at most chimpanzees and humans are about 85% similar.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's do a little math real quick here and go. All right, we have 3 billion base pairs in our DNA,
Mm-hmm.
and if you take 15%, which is the difference between us and chimpanzees,
Yep.
15% of 3 billion is 450 million.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how many differences there are between us and chimpanzees in our DNA code.
Yeah.
So that's a huge amount of differences.
Yeah.
And it makes sense. If you look at a chimpanzee and a human, we don't look 1% similar. I
No.
mean, we function differently, we walk differently, our our intelligence is much different, our creativity is much different. I mean, it just goes. I mean, the list goes on and on. And so it never made much sense to me that we would be 99% similar to
Mm-hmm.
chimpanzees. And
Mm-hmm.
this new study has shown that we are not.
Yeah, and we'll link that study in the show notes of this episode so that you can go and read into it yourself. But at the end of this, I mean, we've talked about this evolutionary theory and what could possibly have caused the vast amounts of complex code that is our DNA. And we've talked about, could it be mutations, and could it be natural selection? Well, what if those have fallen apart, which we've seen, what is there left? What could it be? And in summary, while evolution is still the only theory of life taught in schools, we think that life is intelligently designed by an intelligent creator. And this provides the best explanation for the complexity and the diversity of life we see in our world. I mean, I just think about being an engineer myself and how much information that I sift through and that I have to write code for, and it doesn't even come close to the complexity of a human life. And if anything in my code is wrong, then nothing works the way it is. Just like if anything in our code, our DNA is wrong, we get mutations like Down syndrome and like autism and things like that. Those are mutations that are not the way that it's designed. And so it shows, in my opinion, that we were designed intelligently by this intelligent creator who has a mind that is far beyond ours. And there's a few Bible verses that this reminds me of, because I think that the evolutionary theory at its core reduces us to a clump of cells.
Yep.
If we are nothing more than the product of millions and millions of years of evolution, then we have no intrinsic value. We are just highly intelligent animals, and we can and should be treated as such. We're just animals. But if we were designed, then we have a purpose and we have a value to the creator who designed us. And in the Bible, it shows this. Psalm 139, verses 13 through 14 says, "For you were created in my utmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well." We have value. We're designed. God knit us together in our mother's womb. We're not an accident. Another one, Luke 12, 6 through 7. "Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? Yet not one of them is forgotten by God. Indeed, the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows." God knows the number of hairs on your head. He knows the order of amino acids in every strand of DNA in your body. You are not an accident. Listener, you are not an accident. You're worth more than the birds of the air or the animals on the ground. You are not the same as them. You're made in God's image. And despite what Darwin says, despite what Crick says, you are not a cosmic accident. You were designed on purpose with a purpose.
Very well said. Exactly. So, yeah, we would encourage you to dive into this world of intelligent design
Yeah.
and look at the information. Read Dr. Meyer's book, Signature in the Cell. He also has another book called Return of the God Hypothesis, and he's very instrumental in this intelligent design movement, and he is very good resource for that. So I would encourage you to dive into that, and we will link some of this stuff in the show notes. And yeah, we just hope that you guys will just that this will strike some interest and some
Yeah.
curiosity in you and go, wow,
Definitely.
okay, so let me at least look at this for myself.
Yep.
So yeah, that's really the whole purpose of this podcast,
Yep.
just to get you to start thinking.
Yeah. So
So
thank you all for listening, and we will see you next week.
sounds good. Bye, everybody.